Hello and welcome to today's seminar titled We the People of the States of Bharat, which is second in our series India at 75. We'll be bringing some more interesting seminars around this theme. I am Sanjay Kumar, the India Country Director of the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. The mission of the Institute is to engage through interdisciplinary research to advance and deepen the understanding of critical issues relevant to South Asia and its relationship with the world. As part of this engagement, the Mittal Institute hosts a multitude of events covering topics in the arts, humanities, sciences, education, business, and more. We are so glad you joined us today, both here in this room and virtually. And please consider joining us for our upcoming seminars. A couple of housekeeping items for today. As this is a hybrid seminar, session will be recorded. During the question and answer session, for those who are joining virtually, you can submit questions directly to moderator via the Q&A function on Zoom. Due to the large number of attendees at today's seminar, we unfortunately will not be able to cover all questions. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor S.B. Subramaniam of Harvard University. He is a professor of population health and geography and director of university-wide initiative on applied quantitative methods in social sciences, author of 700 plus articles, book chapters, and books. He is a co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal Science and Medicine, editorial consultant to the Lancet, and international advisory board member for the Lancet Global Health. I would request Subbu to introduce the topic and the speakers for today. I would also like to welcome and thank Dr. Sanjeev Chopra for being the lead speaker and Dr. Amna Mirza for being the discussant today. Thank you for being with us today, and over to you, Subbu.
Thank you, Sanjay. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for facilitating this event, and also to your team at the Mittal Institute. Dr. Chopra, what an honor to be a part of this event, and my most sincere apologies for not being able to be present in person for this particular event. And I also want to thank Dr. Amna Mirza for joining this event to sort of be a discussant. I'm really looking forward to this event. As everyone knows here, we are gathered here to learn and discuss about the evolution of India's internal boundaries. This is a topic very few people have thought in such a organized way, in a systematic way, that it lends itself to almost like a field. And I cannot think of anyone better place to educate us on this other than Dr. Sanjeev Chopra. I say this because the topic is extremely complex and a very vast subject. And this I have learned over my interactions with Dr. Chopra, but both his background, I say that he's best suited because it's very hard for me to slot him in one category. I can think about him as a historian. He has education in law, history. He's a political scientist. He consumes literature from vast areas. He's a creator and curator of literary events and promoting the expression of creative expressions. And of course, last but not the least, a retired administrator from India's topmost service. It's almost seems like a second thought after the rich discussions that I've had the fortune of having with Dr. Chopra over the last year or so. And of course, without his knowledge, he has also turned into a geographer more recently, through this project. Although I will let him speak about how he got motivated about this or during our discussion. Dr. Chopra also has been, a Robert McNamara Fellow at the World Bank, and a very prolific writer. He has several books, as well as he contributes almost on a weekly basis to discussing various projects, and of course, recently on this idea of how states have evolved in India. Besides his current interest, he's also contributed much to the field of cooperatives in India, both through his experience as an administrator, but also as an institution builder and on this topic of cooperatives, which is extremely critical. So with that, I want to sort of not take too much time. I had the fortune of getting acquainted with Dr. Chopra as the director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration, which is from where he retired early this year. Dr. Chopra, what a pleasure. And once again, my apologies for not being able to be there in person. Let me briefly also introduce Dr. Amna Mirza, who's a faculty assistant professor in political science at Delhi University. She's a recipient of the Godfrey Phillips Golden Ovary Award. And she has been kind of, I believe, working a fair bit on global governance, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her thoughts on Dr. Chopra's topic. Before we dive in, I have, the topic that Dr. Chopra is going to be talking about to us. This has lent itself to a book. It's that's the depth of the content we are talking about. Of course, squeezing that in 40-45 minutes is going to be a hard task. But I'm just going to sort of hand this back to the team there to play a very short video from the publisher of the book, from HarperCollins, on this. Sanjay, back to you.
Hello everyone, I hope you're having a good evening. My name is Siddesh Inamdar and I am Executive Editor for Nonfiction Books at HarperCollins India. Like all of you, I was very much looking forward to being there at IIC to attend Dr. Sanjeev Chopra's talk on the subject of We the People of the States of Bharat. But unfortunately, I have not been able to make it there. Fortunately though, and it's my great privilege and honor to be announcing this, HarperCollins will be publishing Dr. Chopra's book on the same subject. It will also have the same title as that of today's talk. It will be called We the People of the States of Bharat, the Making and Remaking of India's Internal Boundaries. Publishing around August next year, it will be the highlight of our list of books that we'll be publishing to mark India's 75th Independence Day. I know and I'm sure that every publisher out there will be publishing a whole range of books to mark this special occasion. But if today's talk is any indication, I'm sure you will agree that this one will be special. So do look out for the book in August next year and make sure that you buy your copy once it's out. Thank you and have a good evening.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much. I guess the plan would now be I'll hand it over to Dr. Chopra to talk about over the next this topic over the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, and then we will hopefully have some time for discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Chopra.
Thank you so much, Subbu, if I can call you Subbu. And in fact, it's a pleasure to, we met around January this year, and it's been a wonderful friendship. We spent a lovely time in the Gandhi Smriti Library at the LBS-NAA.
Yes.
Also sometime in the NCGG. It was absolutely stimulating discussion because I come from the field of history. I just got looking at maps, and he was a profound geographer. So it was really a wonderful interaction with him. And he was able to teach me or guide me with a lot of methodological issues, which I have been a sort of a bureaucrat and a journalist. But he is a profound scholar, and therefore one has learned a lot from him. Thank you so much, Mr. Subramanian. Thank you, Amnaji, for being here. Thank you, Sanjay, for organizing this. We are delighted that we have with us a distinguished member of parliament. Sujit ji is here, Mr. Arun Prashar is here, Mr. Bhagat. Ladies and gentlemen, now And thank you, Siddesh, for your lovely introduction to the book. Okay, friends, we're going to be talking about We the People of the States of Bharat. Now, the reason for choosing this title is that, the preamble to the Constitution talks about We the People. And then we go to, why don't you put on the first slide, Amna? And then we go on to say that India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. Now, there's a very interesting thing here that at one level, we the people, that is we, all the people in this country have constituted Bharat, right? And yet we cannot constitute Bharat without the states. So it's a very interesting thing. And therefore the other aspect is that while the territory of India is sacrosanct, the Article 1 defines the territory of India. We know that Article 3 also gives us the exact descriptions. Yet these internal boundaries of this country have been changing right from 1947. And this is something which is fascinating because there is no other country in the world. I've been trying to look at, we look at the large maps. Even Europe has not changed so much internally as India has. Because when India got her independence on the 15th of August, 1947, there were 9 states, 9 provinces, as they were then called, and 562 odd princely states. Now, getting them all, and the interesting thing is that today, there is not one state, one province, which has the same name or the same territory or the same nomenclature or the same configuration as it was at that time. Not Odisha, not Punjab, not Haryana, not UP, not Kerala, not Karnataka. So this entire internal churn, how this has taken place and what have been the implications of this churn, I carry this little story forward to you because as the stories began like this, that, I had taken the IAS officers, the 2019 batch, we had gone to the Survey of India to see how new survey techniques are developing. And one started looking at the maps and one saw that every time the map of India changes, every time the political configuration of India changes, the Survey of India has to come out with a new map. And so I started looking at the maps and then I thought, let's start writing about it. And it's been a fascinating story since then. So the name itself, India and Bharat. Now, the Britishers wanted us to call ourselves Hindustan. They wanted it to be Hindustan and Pakistan. Now, at that point of time, we decided not to keep the name Hindustan, but chose India, that is Bharat, and decided on India. Now, why we chose India and not Hindustan also, as I find from archival records, is that had we chosen the name Hindustan, then British Empire would have been divided into Hindustan and Pakistan. So we would not be the normal successor state to British India. By choosing the name India, so India then becomes the natural inheritor of everything that British India stood for. Now, it's both semantics and it's also deep understanding. And I think the credit for that goes more to Mr. Menon than even to Sardar Patel, because he was a man who knew the Constitution very well. He was also the advisor to Lord Wavell and then to Mountbatten. So he really understood and grasped this aspect. Now, what would have been the implications if we had chosen to call ourselves Hindustan and Pakistan would have been then every bit of territory and every embassy in the world would have to be divided between India and Pakistan. By deciding to be the successor state, we chose that. Otherwise, in Pondicherry also, Puducherry now, Pondicherry at that time, it was 1/3 Muslim. So they would have said, all right, make 1/3 of Pondicherry into Pakistan. So that is the much larger implication of that. And let's also realize that, you see, there was the 1947 to 1950, that is the first phase of administrative change in the country, which happened. A lot of people feel that it happened because of administrative reasons, but let's also realize that there was a major movement in all the states of the country. There was the Prajamandal movement, which meant that even when the Rajas or the sovereigns wanted to align with anybody else, the people there were very close and wanted to be part of the much larger territories, much larger ethnic territories which they wanted to have. So at that point of time, you see the first map of India, you find that a lot of it, the areas in yellow are what the princely states. So the princely states had 52% of the area and 48% of India's population. So getting this all into one arrangement is something which is fascinating. So you find that paramountcy had lapsed and there was instrument of accession. And I want to make it very clear that we use the term instrument of accession is one aspect. The second is the merger agreement. The instrument of accession only gave 3 rights, defense, communication, external affairs. But the merger agreement was that, all right, you take your privy purses And now that you've taken your privy purses, you are merged into the larger aspect of India. So you at that time you find Pepsu, you find Rajasthan, Madhya Bharat. I mean states whose name some formations like Matsya Pradesh. I mean you don't see it in any map of the country, but there was a formation called Matsya Pradesh which you never came into, which came between 1947, moved out before 1950 even happened. So you had, let's move on because we have a limited time, and let's move on to the next slide. So between the first you saw the map of India in 1947 and the map of India as a republic. So between 1947 and 1950, the changes that took place were that we got most of the princely states, with the exception of the larger states like Jammu Kashmir, you had Hyderabad and Bhopal. Bhopal was merged here, and Mysore. So these were the three states which were 21-gun salute states, which retained their identity. All the others were asked to either make unions of states or they became part of their own. We constituted these states like Pepsu, for example. Pepsu was actually Patiala and East Punjab States Union, so that came up. And you find a very interesting thing that at that point of time, there was a lot of movement by the Praja Mandal itself to get these states together. So we now come, in 1952 was the first time you got a Hindi map in India. The first time that we got a Hindi map of India. So at that point of time, you find that the names have all changed. I mean, Uttar Pradesh has become, United Provinces has become Uttar Pradesh. The names have started changing. And what we find is, that this is the time when, I mean, we're talking about name changes now, but at that time also there was a whole movement, Ganges to Ganga, Mutra to Mathura, Jalandhar to Jalandhar. So this whole set of things and how these names change over a period of time, how names are so significant, that is something which I bring out, in my book. So then you find that Bombay is still, I mean, now of course it is Mumbai. I mean, so what I'm trying also to show is that there is not one state in the country which has the same name. Lakshadweep, for example, was Lakadiv, Amdavi, and Minicoy Islands. And they were under two regimes. There was under, part of it was in the North Malabar district, part of it was under Cochin. So every part of the country, so the Britishers, when they had the regime in the country, they were only looking at an administrative construct. And this administrative construct did not pay any attention to language, did not pay any attention to ethnicity. In fact, most states in the country were multilingual, multi-ethnic, and the voting share, I mean, the number of people who could vote was very limited. So at all points of time, even though we had regular elections, elections that started from 1935, but it was a very limited mandate that these things had started. So this is 1952. Now, 2-3 points about 1952 is very significant. For the first time, the word China appears on the map of India. The word Chin you will find on this map. Up there, the word Chin appears. Before that, the Britishers never used the word China on the map of India. So, it also shows that at that time we were perhaps politically a bit naive because we did not realize the implications of what happens when you put something on the map. Before that, it was shown as Tibet. For the first time in 1952, the name Chin or China, here it's Chin, appears on the map of India. And then, as I will show later, in 1956, Tibet disappears from the map of India. Now here, Tibet is still shown. But in 1956, Tibet disappears from the map of India, which means that all those who went to school, all those who must be, 5-6 years old and who, studied, at that time, there was no existence of Tibet in India. So it also shows that, and the Britishers were very clear about how they looked at borders. We perhaps did not look at borders so closely. That takes me to a lecture which Lord Curzon gave in 1906, the Ramsay lecture at Oxford. He said that the notion of borders in the West and the notion of border in India or in the Asia is very different. In fact, we had always an Aranya Kshetra, that is an area of large forest, between two kingdoms. And Aranya means an area where there is no war, there's no conflict, there's no control. So we did not have such fixed boundaries. So the whole notion of a very fixed boundary is a Western construct. And that is when Mountbatten Curzon said that, where we have dense territories and dense populations, we'll have clear. But they left Nepal, they left the Northwest Frontier Province, and they left Tibet as large buffer areas. These were areas which the British didn't want to rule directly, but they also did not want anyone else to rule these. So these were the buffer territories. So that's another very interesting aspect about this. So as we move on, we'll come to this, but I wanted to highlight the point that in 1956 map, you do not find the reference of Tibet at all. Tibet will again come back to us in 1959. But interestingly, every blame cannot be put on this regime because Tibet refused to recognize India. China recognized India, but Tibet refused to recognize India in 1947. They said that unless you show Darjeeling and Sikkim as part of Tibet, we don't recognize you. So you first recognize that. So there was a little bit of a confusion at that point, but in that process, and that time you were very close to China, so we recognize China. So let's move on to the next one. We are slightly short on time, so I'll have to rush through the presentation. So now what happened was that immediate one thing you must realize that the Congress had decided that India must be divided on linguistic. The Congress organization, and the Congress had the Sindh Circle, the Gujarat Circle, the Maharashtra Circle, all these things the Congress had already agreed from 1918. The provincial committees of Congress were all based on linguistic lines. And therefore, the four people who played a very important role in sort of freedom movement or in deciding the way this country would move, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Patel, and Nehru. Now, all of them disagreed on many things. They all disagreed on many things. But the one thing that they agreed on was that India has to be organized on linguistic lines. On this, they were all very clear. So, of course, immediately after independence, Nehru felt that there are other pressing priorities in the country, and we need not press the linguistic reorganization of states so clearly. He said that, he had this feeling, but immediately after independence, the first Potti Srimalu, he had this. In fact, before that also there was a hunger strike. But the death of Potti Srimalu for the demand of Andhra Pradesh. In fact, Andhra had already been conceded, had nearly been conceded, but because of the resistance from Madras, especially C. Rajagopalachari, and also at that point of time they wanted to shift the water. So water conflict also started at that time because it's actually a share of resources. It's a share of water resources that led to this. So once Potti Srimalu died, Andhra had to be conceded. But if Andhra had to be conceded, then the demand for the reorganization of states had to be accepted. So Nehru had to announce very reluctantly the formation of the States Reorganization Commission with Justice Fazl Ali as the chairman, H.N. Kunzru, and H.N. Kunzru, Fazl Ali, and K.N. Panikkar. Thank you. K.N. Panikkar was the third person in this group. And the interesting thing about this is that they never agreed. They did not agree on many things. And the dissenting notes of these people, that is also reflected in the SRC report. The SRC report and the Mandal Commission report are the two most well-read reports in the country. So, in fact, sometimes I find that the number of hits on the Mandal Commission report are higher than the number of hits on the SRC, but these are very closely competing reports. And these are also the reports which have sort of defined the nation. These are reports that define the nation in the sense that the map that you see in 1956 is actually a foundational map. By this time, Andhra has been made and the other states have also been created. In fact, all the reorganization of the South has taken place by the time in 1950. Can we, I don't know whether we can get the 56 map. If it's possible to get the 1956 map. I don't know whether we can get it, but in fact, the most interesting paper on the linguistic reorganization of states was submitted by Dr. Ambedkar way back in 1948 to the first committee which went into the linguistic reorganization of states. Dr. Ambedkar also received a delegation from the Sikh leaders of Punjab in which they wanted a separate area for the Sikhs. And Dr. Ambedkar advised them that as long as you're asking for a linguistic province where the Punjabi would be the dominant language, we'll support you, we'll go ahead with it. But obviously you cannot divide the country, you cannot have this thing. So that's another instance that happened. So 1956 is then the foundational map of the country. So as I mentioned here, Justice Fazl Ali, K.M. Panikkar, H.N. Kunzru, they submitted a 267-page report. They had received about 1.5 lakh memoranda. And wherever they went in the country, there were demonstrations and counter demonstrations. Some people wanted a state, other people did not want the state. So they did a sort of a great job in trying to, to get to various things. But certainly they were able to resolve the issues of the South. So the four states in the South, that is Mysore, at that time Madras, Andhra Pradesh, and Kerala, which came about when Travancore and Cochin came together. That is something which happened at that time. So, in fact, Ambedkar at that point of time also said that you're creating the balkanization of the South and the consolidation of the North. So that is something. Not because you're sitting here, Sujit, but I must mention here that the contribution of Hare Krishna Mehtab in the integration of Indian states is something which has not been recorded as much as it should have been done. In fact, his contribution, I must place it on record, that his contribution, he was a very bold person. He had differences with Mr. Nehru also, but he was the one person who said that no. In fact, on Sikkim, he was very clear. He pointed out the mistake that we are doing in not closely integrating with the country. So by this time, all this has started happening, and this is 1956. But 1956 led to two bilingual states were still left, Bombay and Punjab. Now, these are the two states where because once we've accepted the principle of linguistic, of language being the basis, then the whole point was that if language is the basis for creation of Kerala, if language is the basis for the creation of Madras, still called Madras, not Tamil Nadu, then why is it that Bombay and Punjab have been left behind? Now, the reason for Bombay and Punjab having been left behind is also politics, is also a lot of other things. But one thing is that the SRC was always in favor, was always saying that states which are bordering, that border states must be large states. There must be states which should have the administrative wherewithal to take care of themselves. And that is why, contrary to public agitation, contrary to what the public wanted, the SRC not only recommended that Punjab should continue to be a big state, they also wanted the merger of Himachal Pradesh, the Union Territory of Himachal Pradesh also. They wanted that should also be merged with Punjab, which led to a lot of dissent, a lot of resentment in Himachal Pradesh, because for the last 7-8 years, Himachal had emerged as a chief commissioner's province, and therefore all this happened in 1956. Be that as it may, the 1956 report was received well in the South, but it met with a lot of resistance both in Punjab and in the United Bombay. Now, Bombay, the reasons for not being able to to have Gujarat and Maharashtra was on Bombay City. Bombay City was the jewel in the crown, as they would say. And one proposal was that let's make Bombay into a union territory. Now, interestingly, all the major cities of this country, major metros, there's always been a demand to have them as UTs. But there was a demand to have Bombay as a union territory. There was a demand to have Hyderabad as a union territory much earlier also. And in fact, Ambedkar had proposed that Hyderabad should be the winter capital of this country. Similarly, with Madras, when the conflict happened, both Andhra, both the Telugu-speaking people and the Tamil-speaking people, they wanted Chennai or Madras at that point of time to be in that state. So the compromise, Tirupati went to Andhra, and there's a big dialogue on this issue on how Tirupati went to Andhra, and Chennai. Chennai is named after a Telugu goddess, incidentally. So Chennai continued to be part of Madras, and Tirupati, which has Tamil priests, went to Andhra Pradesh. And of course, a lot of linguistic, a lot of this territorial waters and other things happened. So then we move on. So in 1960, by 1960, now another interesting thing is especially for those, none of the political parties, the major political parties at that time, could agree on what should be their view on the reorganization, because elections had to be fought in the state, but grand policy statements were to be made in the center. So the Communist Party of India could not decide on what their stand should be, because they had even supported the creation of Pakistan. They had wanted the acceptance of nationality as a principle. But by the time 56 happened, Nehru and Kosygin had been cozying up to each other. And therefore, the Communist Party of India could not really take a stand. The Congress stand was that we should have, they did not want to give too much emphasis on linguistic reorganization. But such was the force of linguistic reorganization that the Congress had to allow its members to have a free conscience in submitting memoranda to the SRC. Therefore, in Punjab, you had different congressmen submitting different kinds of memoranda to the SRC. Some saying in favor of Mahapunjab, which was also a demand for the RSS and the Arya Samaj and the Hindi press, and others saying that no, it should be a Punjabi linguistic province. So that's a fantastic story in itself, that how the national political parties could not really give a direction on an issue of this sort, because as I point out in my book, in my forthcoming book, that elections are fought in the state, grand policies are made in the center, and often there's a disconnect between the larger meta-narrative that any political party, be it the Congress or the Janasangh or the BJP or the Communist Party, whatever be the grand narrative, on the ground, the reality is very different. And because elections determine a lot of things, so a lot of these things happen. Now, one very interesting interlude before 1956 happens, there is one instance of two states wanting to come together. That is Bihar and Bengal. In 1954, there is something called the Roy Sinha proposals. B.C. Roy, as the Chief Minister of Bengal, and Sri Krishna Sinha, as the Chief Minister of Bihar, wanted the states to come together. The reason for that is that in 1953, there was a Congress session held in Amritsar. And when B.C. Roy went to Amritsar and he saw the rehabilitation of refugees from Punjab, and he found that it has been done very well, because Punjab at that point of time was a very big area, right up to Gurgaon. You know, it was the area of Punjab. And he felt that all the people who had come from East Pakistan, they were settled in Karnal, Panipat, Sonipat, Murthal, you know, Faridabad, Ghaziabad, not Ghaziabad, Faridabad, Gurgaon. So this is where they got it. The people who lost their land in the canal colonies in Montgomery and Lyallpur, they were all settled in Hisar and in Karnal, and they were adequate tax there. On the other hand, the people who came in from East Bengal, West Bengal was already very populated, and these people were sent, some of them were sent to Andaman, some of them were sent to Dandakaranya, some of them were sent to Pilibhit. So what happened was that there was no political voice for the Bengali refugee. And this area of Jharkhand was still, I mean, there was hardly any population here. So B.C. Roy felt, and so did Sri Krishna Sinha, felt that in order to create, if it was the same administrative setup, the same political setup, then there would be a voice. For example, displaced Punjabis coming from Pakistan, you know, did have a political voice and a political say in the then large Punjab, which, imagine now a group of 5,000 Bengalis suddenly being asked to go to Dandakaranya, you know, or being asked to go to Andaman, or being asked to go to Pilibhit, or being asked to go to Udham Singh Nagar. And you still find these colonies of Bengalis in Udham Singh Nagar. Now, so therefore he felt that this is one, and this was welcomed. This proposal was welcomed. The English press was gaga about it. The Congress party was also gaga about it. But on the ground, there was no support for this proposal. Again, which shows that what the larger meta-narrative, whatever the larger political leadership, or what may look administratively very sensible, what would look administratively very sensible, technically very feasible, economically justifiable, may not cut much ice on the ground. And therefore, the Roy Sinha proposals had to be withdrawn. They had to be withdrawn very sheepishly. And I must also mention that the opposition to a united Bihar and Bengal came from the politicians of UP, because the UP politicians felt that if Bihar and Bengal were to become one consolidated state, then the dominance of UP in the politics of India would get affected. And that is something which has always been a theme, a recurring theme, and we'll come to that when we talk about delimitation as well, because the dominance of one state in the overall polity of the country, and the Congress leadership of UP did not like it. The Congress leadership of Bihar and Bengal also didn't like it. Now, this is, so 1960, let me take on to 1960. In 1960, you find that Gujarat and Maharashtra have been created. Unfortunately, a lot of lives were lost. We lost about 106 lives. Now, losing lives on agitation like this is something which is very odd, because much later we realized that, you know, linguistic issues can be sorted out, but it was also the intransigence of Morarji Desai and many other reasons. But let's not go into that. So 1960, when this happened, then Punjab remains the only bilingual state in the country, right? But before we come to that, now the next major change in the country, let's move on, is the creation of Nagaland. In 1963, for the first time, it was agreed, because Naga insurgency has been the longest insurgency, and even 2 days ago, we've seen the very unfortunate event in Nagaland where we lost 13 people, case of mistaken identity. But Nagaland was one classic case of creating a state which was never meant to be economically viable, never meant to be, because from the day Nagaland was created, it was very clear that this is a concession to an ethnic demand. This is a concession to an ethnic demand in the hope that you'll be able to resolve ethnic insurgency in that area. Now, the moment Nagaland was created, there was no way in which Mizoram would not have been created. There is no way in which Manipur would not have asked for a statehood. There is no way in which other small Meghalaya would have happened. Because, one of the things in politics is that one thing leads to a chain reaction. You could not have created Nagaland without then creating the entire, all the sister states of the Northeast. So decisions in politics that happen at any point of time have very, very long-term implications. Very, very, whether they are right or wrong, we'll know after 200 years, but this is what happened. So the creation of Nagaland is therefore a very important aspect where the political leadership overruled the SRC, overruled a lot of other things, and knew from day one that Nagaland will have to be sustained. But part of the agreement with Nagaland was also the creation of a Naga force, a Naga battalion. A lot of credit goes to Major Bob Cutting, who was in fact, Major Bob Cutting, a very remarkable person. He was the person who took over the Tawang monastery with Jairam Ram Daulat Ram, he later on became our ambassador to Myanmar, then called Burma, was the deputy commissioner of Mokokchung when this happened. And 3 people had to lose their lives. The person who was designated as the chief minister, Sakire, then Mr. Ao. So 2 people lost their lives. Chief minister candidates lost their life, but we had this. Then the next step, the next phase in the reorganization of India's boundaries is, of course, 1965. After the 1966, actually, 1965, we had the war with Pakistan. And after the war with Pakistan, it was realized that, you cannot have border areas with people not being very comfortable. So people need to have their own power. They need to have their own authority. So that's how this thing happened. Now, I've been telling the story so many times that I forgot about 1961. 1961 is when I'll show the map of 1961. Can we go to the map? In the map of 1961, you'll find that, the map of 1961 had been made by the Surveyor General of India sometime in October. Then in the month of December, we decided to take over Goa. Decided to take over Goa means that the country decided that enough is enough. It's time that Goa came back to India. So rather than make a new map, those were the days of economy measures, I think. So they just put a black tape. So you find in the earlier maps, Goa, it would show Portuguese position. So on this, they just put a black tape. So I've called this chapter Black Tape over Portuguese position. Now, you see, how history is connected. If the Berlin Wall had not broken down, if they started setting up the Berlin Wall in 1961. When the Berlin Wall came up in 1961, all the focus of NATO was on the Berlin Wall. And there an internal discussion happened in NATO that whether we will support each other anywhere in the world or whether our treaty is limited to NATO only. Before that, Portugal had been taking the plea that if there is a fight between India and Portugal, then Americans would move in anywhere, right? So that was the thing. But because Berlin Wall, it was only after the Berlin Wall that it became very clear. Now, you see, let me tell you about how part of the way I've researched this is, the best, not the best, I'm sure there are many other ways of looking at history. But, after 40 years, the records of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of England have been declassified. Therefore, every fortnight, the High Commissioner of UK in Delhi and the Deputy High Commissioners in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras used to write a report to their head office in London, to the FCO office, detailing what has happened in the last 15 days. And they would set cuttings of newspapers, cuttings from Hindu, Hindustan Times, Times of India, Tribune. So all that is now freely accessible and freely available. So one must compliment the record keeping and the Transparency Act in England, that a lot of it is now available, because that shows how the British foreign policy was being imagined. Because on the case of Portugal coming back to India, we have dispatches from the Portuguese ambassador of England in Lisbon, talking about how Lisbon is reacting to them, and ultimately telling those people there that now you have a conflict. Now you could choose between the jewel and the crown. I mean, because England was also notionally heading the Commonwealth, was also part of a lot of the NATO alliances. So they have to choose between whether they'll be here or whether they'll be there. So that's about the 1961, the Berlin Wall and the liberation of Goa. So I've covered 61, I've covered 65. We just got another 10 minutes, but let's move on. The next major change that because along with Nagaland is the dismemberment of Assam that had to happen. And part of the reason why the dismemberment of Assam happened was that, and again, that's one of those big ifs of history, had Assam not been insistent on forcing Assamese in Mizoram and in all these other places, maybe Assam could have continued. But sometimes when you become very chauvinistic in your approach, when you become too chauvinistic in your approach, you alienate many other people. So that's what happened there. So in fact, the entire movement of whether it was the Mizos or the Nagas or the Meghalayas, they said, we would like to be a part of India, but we want out from Assam. They were very clear in that sense. So the sentiment was against Assam. The sentiment was not against India. And that's what we find repeated in several areas and several parts. Even during the GNLF agitation or thing, I mean, the opposition is to Bengal. The opposition is not to India. The Bodos, the opposition is not to India. The opposition is to Assam, the state where they immediately come from. We'll move on now. And the next major change in the geographical formation of India and the political geography of India is Sikkim. You see, because in 1974, the merger of Sikkim, there's a map is of 1979. I mean, the merger took place in 74, 75. So, Sikkim, it is not very easy to just say that because the Constitution of India is very clear. So the Constitution had to be amended. The 35th and the 36th Amendment took place to ensure that Sikkim is now made a part of India. Now, the story of Sikkim is also very interesting. That shows how over a period of time, when demographics takes over, political changes have to take place. Sikkim was part of the Bhutia tradition, part of the Lepcha. In fact, it was the Lepcha kingdom taken over the Bhutias. And in 1870s, because they were mainly monastic in their approach, they invited the Nepali workers to come and cultivate the lands around the monasteries. In 30 years' time, the population of Nepalis grew because they were more hardworking. And in the Buddhist tradition, a lot of them became monks. And so, what happened was that by the turn of the century, the turn of the previous century, the number of Nepalese and the number of ethnic Bhutias and Lepchas was almost equal. And by 1947, the overall majority of Sikkimese was actually Nepalese. So in 1947, when the majority population of Sikkim wanted to be a part of India, they wanted to be a part of India. And this is a total myth that is created by a book by Sunanda Kedatta Ray, which is written totally from the Chogyal's perspective that, smash. No, the fact is that the majority of the people at that time were Nepalese, and they had no stake in a system in which they did not get representation, in which they did not get Sikkim Assembly was such that it had 20 seats for Nepalese, 20 seats for Bhutias, and 20 seats for Lepchas. Whereas the population of Nepalese was about 65 to 67% at that time. So for 67% people, you give 20 seats. And these are all things that will come up again when we discuss delimitation. I mean, how do you manage these very difficult questions which have no easy answers? So that is how Sikkim became a part of India. So that's that we find in 1974. After that, there's a little lull, of course. States, I mean, UTs are becoming states. So, there's a gradual process. So Manipur, Tripura, first were chief commissioners, then they became UTs, and then they became states. The next major reorganization that we find is then by 2000, there is a bipartisan consensus on the creation of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Uttaranchal at that point of time. Now, by this time, the polity has matured. And by this time, what has also happened is that the BJP has agreed in principle to the concept of larger states, to the concept of breaking up of states. They realize that the breaking up of a state is not the breaking of Bharat. So that is why it's interesting to note that the term that the preferred term of BJP was not Jharkhand or Uttarakhand. The preferred term for them was Vananchal and Uttaranchal. I mean, they sort of were not very comfortable with the use of the word Khand. But the public demand was for Uttarakhand, was for Jharkhand, and therefore over a period of time they accepted. And I think these are the three states that were made with bipartisan consensus, in the sense that here the BJP and the Congress are both trying to claim credit for having created these states. So in Uttarakhand or Uttaranchal, the BJP said we've done it. Congress said we have done it. Poor Uttarakhand Kranti Dal, which had raised the banner, wanting a separate state, that got forgotten. They didn't even get a single seat. They got a seat once or twice. So they're totally lost in the whole thing. This is again a very interesting thing, that Chhattisgarh and especially Jharkhand, these are areas where the tribals, especially in Jharkhand, the tribals were no longer a majority, and yet even the non-tribals felt that it is better to have a small state with regional identities. So this creation of these three states, especially Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, is an example of how a regional identity is being forced in this country. How regional identity is being forced in the country. So around the turn of the century, we thought that all right, everything is okay. Kafi ho gaya. Now the country should have a fairly stable sort of a system. But then, this agitation started. And now Telangana, this whole concept of that, other than Hindi-speaking states, all other languages at one state. So Bengalis, Maharashtra, Marathis, Tamil, Tamil for Tamil Nadu, and then this whole lava burst in so far as Andhra state is concerned. So Andhra has had three formations. You had Andhra state, that is Andhra 1.0. Then you had Andhra Pradesh, which is 1.1 and 1.2, and then you finally have Andhra and Telangana. Now, Andhra and Telangana, let's understand the fact that although Hyderabad was Telugu speaking, and so were the other parts, yet the tradition of Hyderabad and the Telangana region was very different from the Andhra region. So for one, the hinterland was Chennai, for other, the hinterland was Bombay. So a lot of things happened. And finally, as we are all aware that in 2014, we had, again, there was a bipartisan consensus here. I mean, everybody said this and that. Even the TDP at some point of time said that let there be two states. So Telangana comes. Now, when Telangana is made, that really opens up the whole possibility. And that's something that we'll have to discuss. That opens up the whole possibility that if Telugus can have two states, why should a large state like Maharashtra not have two states? I mean, why can't there be two states in Maharashtra? Why can't there be two states in Tamil Nadu? What should be the size of a state? What can be the possible size of a state? These are all things that start happening. So, and the last major change that I'll talk about before we move on to the next very important subject of delimitation is the creation of the Union Territories of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, before that happens, I want to tell you that in 1947, the name of the state actually was Jammuwa, Kashmirwa, Tibetwa, Ladakh. So the actual official name of Jammu at 1947 was Jammu, Kashmir, Ladakh, and Tibet. That was the mental concept. I mean, that was, in fact, there are stamps issued in that name. There's a coinage of that time is representative of these. So from this we link up to the entire issue that we have, the Sky Chain and all. So it is not that the claims to Tibet that we have, or the portion of Tibet that we have, comes from the fact that this area was part of the geographical construct of Jammu Kashmir. And of course, Gilgit-Baltistan had been leased out to the British by the then sovereign of the thing. But in 2019, 5th August, a very important day. 5th August is a very significant day. So on 5th August 2019, the state of Kashmir, the state of Jammu and Kashmir became the Union Territories of Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh. Now, what I want to tell you here is that Ladakhis in 1948, I don't know, can we go back to the map of 1947? You see, at that point of time, the entire area of Tehri Garhwal, Lahaul, Spiti, all that was part of British Punjab. And the Ladakhis at that point have said that, please merge us with Lahaul, Spiti and Garhwal region, because they felt that Lahaul, Spiti and Ladakh were much more closer to each other ethnically, linguistically, and on the basis of religion than there. So they wanted that. So you see this area, there is a little continuity. So that area, we could have had, even at that point of time, a very strong Himalayan state up in the north. But that was not, in fact, once Ladakh was made, the Ladakh Buddhist Association went on record by saying that our demand from 1948 of wanting to get out of Kashmir has finally been accepted. So they thanked the thing. So these are the interesting stories about so Lakshadweep and Andamans I want to share with you. And Andamans, of course, the name of Port Blair has not been changed, but it has been called Shahid Dweep, it has been called various things. Mount Harriet is now called Mount Manipur. Mount Harriet was a very important place in Andamans because a lot of our prisoners there were kept. They were from Manipur, so it's called Mount Manipur. So a lot of changes of names have taken place. Now, Andaman itself is a very fascinating story. Andaman and Nicobar, again, have two different stories. But the penal settlements of Andamans is actually one has to really accept the fact that it was the sort of sacrifices which our freedom fighters have made at that point of time. I'm writing a little series on Andaman and Nicobar Islands as well. So when we discuss it in detail, we'll have that thing. So we must pause here we'll have to pause here because time is like a gypsy, it just flies. And the next important thing that we have on the annual is delimitation. Now, we do a literature festival called the Valley of Words. We're happy that our board member, General Pannu, is here with us. In Valley of Words, we discussed the whole aspect of delimitation because what is going to happen is that in 1971, the last delimitation happened in the country. But from 1971 to now, we have grown. We've grown much bigger than we did not grow as much from 1952 when the first delimitation was held to 1971. The growth was okay. So from about less than 400 seats, we came to 552 seats. But if we were to look at the constituencies today, so that's why this new parliament, this 800-seater, because today a typical MP is representing something like 15 to 20 lakh voters. And even an MLA in some places is representing about 4 to 5 lakh voters. And again, in Lakshadweep, he represents much less, but that's a much larger issue. I'll leave that to the lead discussant to not only comment on this, but also to take the discussion on delimitation forward. And with this, I think I can take my seat there.
Yeah, sir, please join.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for the very interesting, remarks. And I'm going to be, picking on from all the important arguments that you made. So you said that history is connected. And, allow me to share this very important primary information. Why I say primary information? Because while we were curating this session, Vox Populi, speaking out and reaching out to parliamentarians across political parties, the arguments, what we heard with reference to the entire North-South resistance that Sir pointed out with reference to 1956 report, the very big argument of demographics being connected to governance dynamics. These two important arguments have been, voiced out by various political members of parliament from various political parties while we were addressing the bigger question of delimitation. Sanjeev sir, we all know that 4 delimitation commissions have been set up. Our seats were frozen till 2026. We all know, we are hearing it from various sources that there is a proposed idea to redraw, Lok Sabha constituencies. Once again, backing the argument that while we reached out to all political parties, all the major political parties, the members from the government, there is a consensus with reference that there is a need to change. There is a need to accept and adapt ourselves to reforms. Because of course, text and context have changed. We have to be in consonance with changed realities. But on that note, what you pointed out, that how with reference to the diverging population trends, with reference to North and South dynamics, the members of parliament for whom we spoke to from Telangana, from Odisha, from Kerala, they openly voiced out this concern that why should be states which have, which have managed their population trends or their demographics better, why should they be penalized with reference to that? While you were pointing out your various arguments, that how quite often support for proposals has to be vetted by the political sensibilities also. While we address the topic of delimitation, once again, there is this issue that will it be the same story again, that it will be having dominance of North over South with respect to Uttar Pradesh having more people, because if you try to balance the demographics with reference to the territorial governance aspect, once again, the story will be the same, that we'll be having dominance of UP. And then, is this big decision of reforms, though always welcome. And again, we have the Vox Populi this year, where we had the 8 MPs in official, but allow me to share this to you. Very interesting thing, that we had to delimit the number of MPs also. We received a phenomenal response. MPs from all political parties came forward, expressed their views, but we had to delimit it. So we reached out to 12 MPs and we had to delimit it to 8 MPs, keeping pace with the timings of the program also. But there was this very important argument that has been made by all, and again, when we talk about the 2000 delimitation, we had someone from Madhya Pradesh pointing out that whether will this futuristic exercise of delimitation, will it have this overdose of political contouring also? So your remarks on that.
You see, one of the things that is very clear is that if the delimitation exercise is done in 2026, we will have to, there's the doctrine of adequacy of representation, the doctrine of proportionality. I, for one, am very clear that, representation will have to be given on the basis of population. Therefore, this means that we need to reorganize our states, because you can't have states which are so large, and because you cannot change the size of Sikkim, you cannot change the size of Lakshadweep, you cannot change the size of Manipur or Tripura or any of these states. So I think it's time that we had a new reorganization commission, which takes into account not just the areas that can be there. So I think, because as a matter of fact, the UP Assembly is already on record wanting a division of UP. The resolution has not been overturned. So I think that it's high time that we had a new reorganization commission, and the larger states are reorganized into smaller units. So that, typically, to my mind, India can afford to have 50 states, 60 states, where no state should have more than, about 20 to 30 to 40 MPs at best, so that, there is some sort of parity. You cannot have states with 100 MPs and states with just 2 MPs or 3 MPs. Now, obviously, we cannot create 100 states, but certainly it's time that both for purposes of administration and also for purposes of parity, so I think it's high time that the second reorganization commission was set up. And this time, if the reorganization commission is set up, it should be very inclusive in its approach, because the last reorganization commission that we had was basically jurists. And they were not in active politics. They were academics, and they were, people from the world of history, from the world of this. But I think we need to have a very broad-based states reorganization commission, which will look at the administrative boundaries of states, political boundaries of states, because we do need to ensure that there is some parity among the states of Bharat, because that's the point which I keep on saying, that we, the people, have created Bharat. But we, the people of the country, also have to look at how many states there have to be, because there has to be parity between states. Otherwise, we'll have a situation where the domination of one state over all the rest will continue forever and ever and ever, and that may not be politically acceptable. No, I won't use the word may not. I would say will not be acceptable. And you cannot have yet another round of dissonance on an issue which we can resolve. So now that we have still 5 years to go, I think it's time for the political leadership of the country, the administrative leadership of the country, to at least point out that these are going to be the difficulties, so let's just sort it out. And let me tell you, it makes take the case of Uttarakhand. When Uttarakhand was made, there were 70 seats, 42 were in the hills, and 28 were in the plains. Now, after in the next set, it was 36 in the hills and 34 in the plains. Now, these are all realities that we have to accept. These are all realities that we also have to understand, that can there be alternate ways of giving political expression? Can it be through councils? Can it be through a new empowered sixth schedule? What are the ways in which we can handle this? But these are problems that are going to come up. Now, the point is that before these problems come up, and we have 5 years to look into these issues. So I think as political scientists, as those who are interested and invested in this country, we must start looking ahead and start preparing for these questions as they will appear.
One more here, sir. So, of course, you've really, thoroughly engaged all of us in this wonderful, beautiful historical journey of the country. but we also know that you have a wonderful administrative side also. Because why I point this out, because the question of delimitation is linked to the question of governance also. While we were speaking to a lot of MPs, they said that you have to now understand that as an input, if you are trying to redraw the boundaries or the number of constituencies, or perhaps increase the number of seats in the national legislature, with the expectation of the outcome that we will be having good governance as the output. But when you look at the present structure, there are so many political parties, there are so many MPs which hardly get any time to address their concerns. Or perhaps looking at the bigger picture of how the entire electoral machinery is somewhere working, in a manner which favors those which have more resources as compared to the other. So in that realm, sir, will delimitation alone be sufficient enough to cater to the big question of governance then?
No, delimitation cannot be the solution to every problem in this country. I mean, delimitation is just one of the issues which is there. I mean, there's a much larger issue about how are we running our country, because there's a point which many MPs, including Manish Tiwari, has made, that parliamentarians are not getting the time or the resources to actually legislate. In fact, when parliamentarians and legislators have to nurture their constituencies, that is actually an administrative work. Oh, that's another question on whether we can continue, because it is actually a de facto presidential form of government that we have. I mean, the votes are cast in the name of the prime minister or the chief minister. So it's a de facto presidential form of government that we already have. But that's not what the topic of today is. But the larger issue is about how states will have to be reorganized, or states can be reorganized. In fact, there's this famous case of Justice Hemchandra Gupta when Bengal wanted to, when he didn't want the areas of Bengal, Berubari, when he didn't want them to go to Bangladesh or to Bengal. He said that that I am a citizen of Bengal. The court struck it down. He said nobody is a citizen of Bengal. But one thing is there that, and I must share this incident with you, that in 1992, when we had to hand over Teen Bigha to Bangladesh, it's taken us so long to settle our disputes with Bangladesh. In fact, hats off now that we've now solved our enclave exclave problem. But in 1992, I was the ADM of Cooch Behar, and I was writing this paper. I'm preparing the background note for this discussion. So at that point of time, also it was pointed out that India cannot hand over Teen Bighas. So India leased Teen Bighas for 999 years at a lease rent of ₹1, which the President of India was then pleased to say, we are a rich country, we don't need ₹1 from Bangladesh. But that apart, the fact is, you see, technically, Teen Bigha is still a part of India. So technically, the president can withdraw his happiness. I mean, the president can be pleased to take Teen Bigha back. So these are all the interesting aspects about the way we have to evolve, the way we look at things. And so one of the things that comes out remarkably in the research which I'm doing is that countries which are flexible and nimble, and which have the ability to absorb tensions and to adjust and to take into account the aspirations of people, they do well, in contrast to those who are very rigid. I mean, take the case of our neighboring country, Pakistan. In Pakistan, at the time, in 1956, when India was creating many states, Pakistan decided to make one unit. Pakistan actually abolished Punjab and Sindh and NWFP and made one unit. So we have this very interesting contrast between India and Pakistan. India celebrating and respecting her diversity. In fact, today I was talking to the Cambodians in the morning. I was addressing the Cambodian civil servant. They said, "How do you manage it?" I said, "We manage it like the Indian currency." So I showed them the Indian currency with 2,000 rupees written in 22 languages. So how do you do it? I said, "We do it and we celebrate it. I mean, there's no problem. There's no problem. In fact, the more you celebrate diversity, the more you recognize ethnicities, the more we recognize language, the more we recognize the different. The concept is that Bharat, the concept of Bharat as India. Now, that is the sacrosanct thing. Now, what happens within the borders of the India, we got to be flexible, we got to be nimble. And if we are more nimble, we'll do much better. And the country has shown. And in fact, over the last few years, there's a bipartisan consensus that we must respect regional aspirations. We must respect various languages. So I think we are on the right track. This delimitation is going to pose a challenge, but I'm sure we have the political sagacity to handle this.
Dr. Chopra, I think I want to really once again thank you for this both the lecture as well as the comments that followed Dr. Mirza's points. I do apologize if for rushing you through, because I know what the audience heard today is really a glimpse, and I really encourage all of you to kind of before the book comes out, the specific stories that Dr. Chopra has been publishing in the media. If I may, I want to sort of, I really picking on your last point about this, how do you strike a balance between we, the people of Bharat, alongside we, the people of a, whatever that identity might be, this Bengal being a very good example. I think that striking that balance, obviously, as you, if I can kind of infer from that, requires some degree of maturity with regards to being secure about the notion of we, the people of Bharat. I think this tension of allowing for regional aspirations, and I too concur with you that over the last decade or two, there is that maturity is coming. But alongside that political maturity, I was wondering if you could speak to the administrative aspects. So the Indian administrative service, or to my knowledge of the little I've learned over the last year, is an all India service. And but at the same time, so that's like we the people of Bharat kind of analogy, so it's an all India service, it's a service to the country. But at the same time, the functioning and the day-to-day aspect throughout the bulk of your career is kind of tied to a state, if not half of that to the district within the state. So do you see, as we think about this, it's not just a boundary issue, and that I've come to appreciate in our discussions. So how do you, this is something that I've been thinking about, having learned about the academy and the civil service a little bit. How do we then, is there a need to also sort of think about not a reorganization, whatever we want to call it, reform, or how do we bring that into this thing, this all India service notion, but at the same time, most officers, to my knowledge, are in a state with some deputation to the center. So if you could speak something to that, I would appreciate it.
It's very, very interesting, very important. But I personally feel, you see, that whether you have 30 states and then you're moving from center to state, or you have 50 states and then you're moving from center to state, it should not pose a major challenge for us, because the recruitment will continue to be as it is. In fact, what will happen, and what I envisage, is a situation where more and more decentralization of functions will start taking place. In fact, as we are speaking, you see, the fact is that with GST happening, with the right to food, with right to work, with several national programs being rolled out, a lot of direction of these programs is going to be with the union government. And most states, it's not saying that the states will not be very important, but the fact is that most programs that are now being run in the district, most programs that are now being funded in the district are national programs. For instance, whether it is the MREGA, whether it is the right to food, or the right to work, or the right to education. So the policy parameters are being set by the union government. They are being implemented at the level of the states. What will happen is that there'll be a direct connect between the state and the districts. I mean, intermediate levels, I mean, the role of divisional commissioners, for example, will go down. A lot of other things will start happening. But I mean, I don't see a problem if instead of a large state like UP, if there were 4 states. So we are looking at I would ideally look at about 50 states in the country, where it'll be easier for the chief ministers also to connect. It'll be easier because at the end of the day, it is the implementation of programs that's going to make a difference. And as you've been working in the health sector, even at the level of even when it comes to monitoring, let's say that, a chief secretary or a chief minister has to review. I mean, if you have to review 20 districts or 25 districts, it's possible. If you have to review 100 districts, how are you going to do it? I mean, how do you even have a meeting with 100 district magistrates? So it is posing, because the other thing is that, people are also aspiring for smaller districts. People are also aspiring for smaller blocks, because everybody wants a direct share in the way things are happening. So we also started, Mr. Prashar is here, I think he'll bear me out, that at some point of time, Punjab had the United Punjab had about 13 districts. Now I think there are 14, 15, 18 districts in Punjab. There are about similar number of districts in Haryana. So, so the number of districts has increased, the number of blocks is increasing, number of tehsils is increasing. So managing these also means that you have to have smaller states. At the end of the day, Bharat as a concept, and Bharat as a concept, I'll take you back to the very first chapter of Mahabharata, very first chapter of the Gita, in which, Dhritarashtra is telling Sanjay to recount to him which are the armies on the Kaurava side and which are the armies on the Pandava side, right? So the concept of Bharat is there, it's been there. So sometimes Matsya Pradesh will become part of Rajputana, sometimes this will become part of that. So this little amorphous thing is always been happening. Take the case of Odisha, for example. I mean, sometimes this portion goes there, this portion goes there, but in a sense, roughly, we know where things are happening. So I think it'll be a very welcome thing if we, and the whole thing is that you can belong to a state, you can belong to a linguistic group, and you belong to Bharat at the same time. So there's no contradiction to my mind. And as we have more districts, more tehsils, more blocks, we will need smaller states, And it will also, I think, to a large extent, I think most political parties are now more or less agreed on the fact that smaller, and the empirical evidence of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, Telangana also shows that if you have a smaller state, you tend to do better.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Chopra. I think, as you know, we have briefly discussed this notion of also at the district level, but I can see from some of the remarks that you have made, once you make the state smaller, you kind of change that both the identity and the governance aspect gets kind of more merged together, which is really the goal, I guess. And I really appreciate that. I think I don't want to hog the, the privilege of being a moderator or Amna being discussant. So, maybe let's open this up, Amna, to for the brief 10 or 15 minutes we have with the audience.
Yes, sir. Well, there's a very interesting question in the chat box, and Sanjeev said this is something very similar to what you were talking about, that how the idea of Bharat is so holistic. Now, this question says that how is state identity detrimental to national unity?
It is not. A good Punjabi or a good Mizo or a good Naga is also a good Bharatiya. So I think there is no contradiction. In fact, you become better. There is no problem at all. I mean, you can have multiple identities. You can be a good Christian, you can be a good Hindu, you could be a good Muslim, you could have multiple identities, and yet your concept of being Bharatiya. In fact, the whole thing about being Bharatiya is, and that's why the word Bharat, it comes to us from a very ancient time. So there is no contradiction as such. And the more identities we take on, these identities are working together. They don't take away. I mean, my coming from Punjab and his coming from Orissa and his coming from UP does not make us lesser Bharatiyas. In fact, it makes us stronger. That has been the concept of Bharat. I mean, even at the time when I'm telling you about this opening canto in the Gita, it starts with which are the armies of Bharat. So he's talking about Bharat and says which armies of Bharat are fighting with whom. And you had the same kingdom, half of the army is fighting for the Kauravas and half of the army is fighting for the Pandavas. It's okay, And they were neutral. I mean, 5 states were neutral, including Kashmir was neutral at that time. So it's an interesting story.
Okay, my last one before I invite questions from across the dais also. So this one's asking for a candid yes or no from you, that do you believe that is it convenient to serve and do development work with smaller number of population?
Yes, I think development, we can focus better if the population size is small. I mean, in the sense that if you know exactly what your district size is, I was the DM of Murshidabad in West Bengal, which was a very, very large district, and I can tell you it was I mean, I enjoyed it for 2 years. But the fact is that it is not really possible to give adequate time and attention if the district size at the 1994 had a population of 70 lakhs, 29 development blocks, and 5 subdivisions, 95-kilometer border. One has retained one's sanity. But the fact is that if the district size is smaller, it makes more sense. I think an ideal district size about 8, 10 to 12 development blocks, 2 to 3 subdivisions, about 20 lakh population. This is what a district magistrate, what a superintendent of police, what a CDO, and in fact, not just for the DM, it's also for the district health officer. It's also for the district agricultural officer. Imagine a district agricultural officer in a predominantly rural area, handling 60 lakh. How is it possible? It's a major strain. So I think for monitoring, for development, for interventions, we need to have an ideal district size, we need to have an ideal state size. And of course, the size of India is sacrosanct, that we cannot change. But what we can change, we ought to change.
Great, sir. So we now invite questions from across the dais. Yes.
Yeah, you said that one state is dominating Indian polity, like UP, earlier it was known as United Provinces. So, but UP Legislative Assembly has passed a resolution for dividing it into 4 states. So then it will be like 85 seats, 80 seats, 20 each, 20 odd. So then it will not be there. It will no longer be there if it becomes a reality.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, Dr. Ambedkar, what happens is that if there are 4 UPs, then Kerala will not feel so threatened. Because with 13 seats or 14 seats, and of which some of them will disappear if the new population area is done. So Kerala will not feel threatened. Kerala doesn't feel threatened from Uttarakhand, for example. It doesn't feel threatened. But when we look at it from an all India perspective, so imagine that you are from Kerala. You are an MP from Kerala. So everybody, if every state has got about 20, 30, 40 MPs, there will still be some parity among states. But if the delimitation happens and seats are distributed according to current population, then UP will exceed 120, and Kerala will come down. So you will have a major anomaly which will not be acceptable. If you are from Kerala, you will not accept it. I don't know where you are from.
But seats can go down also, like in Kerala.
They are going down. This is precisely the point, that states which have done well in population parameters, the seats will go. Seats will go down in Tamil Nadu, they'll go down in Karnataka, they'll go down in Kerala, they'll go up in Bihar, they'll go up in UP, they'll go up in Rajasthan. So you will end up with, a ballpark figure, you will end up with 120 seats in UP.
Well, a population per constituency would be fixed, like 5 lakh per LS constituency.
It can never be fixed, but there are 2 doctrines. There's a doctrine of adequacy. They will continue to have an MP, but where we can. So both aspects will have to be taken into account: adequacy and proportionality. So you will never have a perfect scale. You'll never have that, you cannot distribute and say that for every, there'll be areas where you will still have 25 lakh people, there'll be areas where you still have, but you cannot have areas with, 30 lakh people and areas with 1 lakh people. So we have to try to narrow it down to the extent possible, to the extent that is practical.
But how will the parity come about? Because there are smaller states, 5 seats or 2 seats.
So parity is that instead of 5 versus 120, we'll have 5 with 25 or 5 with 30. That is the only way, we can look at it. Yes, you wanted to?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Hello. Hello, sir. So you rightly said that we have got 5 years now, and with the new India already there in the form of digital India, the digital India scenario is all over. And do as civil society so that we can place rightly this good governance kind of thought process in the e-governance way before the political parties as well as the ruling party to start with.
I can only say that, the more the more politically aware the population is, the better it would be. But e-governance initiatives are there. I mean, I don't think it is directly related to this. But the only thing that I think what I don't have a clear answer to your question because I don't know how to respond.
Utilizing this digital platform, digital India kind of thought process,
Yes.
let's draw a map.
No, we can
A map in such a way that what you are talking, that we need 50 states. We can do that homework.
No, that homework cannot be done through Digital India. I mean, Digital India can address many issues, but this is not an issue which Digital India can address. I mean, Digital India will of course increase access. We can monitor our schemes better, but this is a question of political economy. This is a question where political parties, political groups, we'll have to sit together and we'll have to look at the long range implications of what happens if we do not. Now, there are three scenarios. One scenario is that we continue and say, all right, for the next 25 years, we do not do the delimitation. Because the fact is that the population of this country started stabilizing. That reports also already say. So one option is that let's not do anything in 2026. Let's wait till 2051, by which time it is also possible that by which time UP's population is also stabilized and all other populations are stabilized. So that's one option. Second option is let's take the bull by the horns and reorganize ourselves. The third option is that let's wait for agitations to start happening and then we react to it.
No,
So there are three.
all that is not.
There are three scenarios, right? Because there'll be some people who will want delimitation. And there are other aspects is that if we do not have delimitation, then by 2035, perhaps there'll be districts in UP where you'll have 35 lakh people. I mean, an MP handling 35 lakh people. I mean,
Of course, it is going
our
to be.
honorable member of parliament. I mean, of course, he's in the Rajya Sabha. He doesn't have that kind of problems which a Lok Sabha MP has, but it's an impossibility paradigm. In fact, the e-governance or the connectivity of the mobile to the MP actually increases the MP's problem. Because everybody is wanting to contact the MLA and the MP, and the MLA and the MP, it cannot really respond to 4 lakh people. It's very, very difficult. So again, from the e-governance and from the mobile, aspect, I think you will need smaller units.
But they say e-governance is an easy governance kind of thing.
But
Yeah,
let him
we can have-
respond.
Yes.
Okay, I'll come back to this in
Thank you.
better way.
Dr. Chopra, very insightful. In fact, we keep joking that a typical MP in India, in terms of population, is equivalent to the head of a small country.
Yes.
Right? So I have a small query on Goa, since you refer to Goa, though it's not directly related to this talk. Goa got liberated in December 1961.
Yes.
By then, the relations with China was extremely frosty.
Yes.
The Chinese premier John Enlai's visit was a failure, and so on. But China was one of the earliest countries to recognize
Yes.
the liberation of Goa and its merger with India. Why?
Now, this is also largely to do with the global politics. It's also got to do with the anti-colonial, measure that China was always taking. And India and China, have been supporting each other diplomatically, and the Afro-Asian bloc. In fact, both both China and India were wanting to, show to the rest of the colonized world that we are with you. That is one thing. But on the issue of Goa, thank you for pointing out. Thank you for bringing. Goa is one state in the country where there is uniform civil code.
Yes.
Few people are aware of the fact that the Uniform Civil Code was started in Goa by the Portuguese. So every regime does something which is good. So in Goa, where you have a mix of Christians and Muslims and Hindus, you've been having Uniform Civil Code in Goa. I don't know why we can't pick up some good practices from here, there, and everywhere. So Goa also teaches a lot of things. Very interesting thing I want to tell you about Goa is about Dadra and Nagar Haveli. For 6 years, Dadra and Nagar Haveli was a de facto liberated territory, in the sense that earlier, of course, you remember this film Saath Hindustani with Amitabh Bachchan's first starrer. So Saath Hindustani, the people of the MGK and the RSS and the others, RS Samajas, they went and took over Dadra and Nagar Haveli, and for 6 years it was an independent area. In 1961, an IAS officer by the name of KJ Bijlani was declared as the Prime Minister of Dadra and Nagar Haveli, and he signed an agreement with Mr. Nehru as the Prime Minister. So that was the only time when an IAS officer became a Prime Minister. So he could sign an agreement with Nehru. So that's something, this little interesting story about Dadra and Nagar Haveli.
If you allow me, I have a query.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I'm a votary of small states, and you did, talk about empirical evidence in favor of small states doing better in terms of governance and development. And you also talked of, India having at least 50, 60 states. Now, where do you draw the line? For instance, I come from Odisha. So I come from western part of Odisha, where there is a separate dialect. So my dialect is not Odia. The official Odia spoken in coastal part of Odisha. We speak a language which is Kosali. And there is a simmering demand for a separate Kosali state now. So, I mean, every 100 kilometers you'll have a separate culture, separate dialect, separate way of life. So where do you draw that line? Once you open the floodgate of more and more smaller states,
Yes,
where do you
sir.
stop that?
I mean, I've been looking at because a lot of information on the website and the internet on demand for new states. The maximum number of states that have been asked for is another 14 or 15 states. I mean, if including that Kodu Nadu and Tamil Nadu and two Maharashtras, Vidarbha being separate. So the maximum demand as things stand now is for another about 12, 13 states. Maximum it will be another. Now there are some states which cannot happen. I mean, Gorkhaland, for example, cannot happen because the Gorkhas are not in a majority even in Darjeeling. So these are some issues. Therefore, Gorkhaland will not happen. But in North Bengal, I hope my ex-chief minister is not listening. But even if she does, I'm now superannuated, so I can take liberties. But North Bengal by itself, I mean, above Murshidabad, so Malda and above, that's a viable state by itself. But Gorkhaland is not a state by itself. So every demand cannot lead to a state. Bodos are not in a majority, even in Kokrachhar. So just because you have a demand, but that demand must be backed by a strong demographics and by a strong ethnicity and by a well understood language. So if that happens, then why not? And we could also have states which are just so large. I mean, Vidarbha, for example, is a fit case. You can have two Maharashtras. Where is the problem in that? And so it's yes, Sunil.
Amna,
Yeah,
Sorry.
Sanjay ji.
Just as he asked, so do you also think that economic viability is also a factor?
Well,
Like as you said in case of Nagaland.
In Nagaland, those were days when now today economic viability is very different than it was in those days. Today, with very strong IT connectivity and various things have changed. I mean, for instance, if you have a series of call centers in a state in which people are speaking English language, it becomes viable. I mean, Arunachal is viable if you look at modern agriculture. So viability is a function of many things today. So viability is, I mean, the way we looked at viability in those days was a very different thing. Certainly, that is why I said that I would look at a state with about 20, 25 MPs, with about 20, 25 districts, which is a viable state. And again, the point is to see that we also will need to address our administrative structures. We do not need, I mean, if we are going to have small states, then we may do away with directorates. We'll have a different set of governance because, we are used to governing in the manner that the message will come from the top and then it will be disseminated in several layers. But I'll give you an example. Now, when this new COVID, Omicron or whatever it's called, now the day the Home Secretary had a meeting, immediately it got disseminated to all the states in the country, all the districts in the country. So you don't really require, I mean, the WhatsApp says it all. So you don't require layers and layers and layers today. So the whole thing is changing. So Sunil, you wanted to say something?
It was almost the same question, sir. But again, if I just quote the bifurcation of Bihar and Jharkhand, sharing of financial resources of the bifurcated states and the governance thereof, that also is a thing to be thought of, sir.
Oh, yes, we have now got the experience of dividing assets. We've got a lot of experience now. We've got experience in dividing cadres. We've got experience of dividing it. So it's not going to be as difficult. It's not going to be as difficult as it was between Punjab and Haryana. We're still fighting over Chandigarh. We're still fighting over these things. But as we evolve, I mean, now more or less, I mean, today, if a new state has to be created, I mean, the Ministry of Home Affairs has a whole, set of precedents to follow. So it's easier to reorganize states today than it would have been in the times of 1953 when the first state was reorganized. So we are evolving, we are learning. So I think there will be problems. I mean, look, we cannot envisage a situation where there will be no problems. There will always be problems. And along with this, there is also the question now of reorganization of district boundaries. You have crazy district boundaries also. In Kuch Bihar, for example, I mean, one part is there, it's closer to Punjab. I mean, you have Kapurthala, Pagwada, Kapur. So I think it's also time to reorganize the districts to make them more at ease with each other. Just because something was settled and we had promised the Maharaja of Kuch Bihar that Kuch Bihar will not change, doesn't mean that a person in Dinahata or a person in Mekhliganj will have to travel all the way. He can be attached to Alipurdwar. So I think it's time. I mean, there are areas in Mussoorie, for example. I mean, parts of Teri Garhwal are on the other side of Mussoorie, so it can be easily avoided. So I think it's time that we took a more realistic look at things. We looked at the cost of administration and so many other factors.
Sir, but in this case, what is happening, like Bihar is seeking a special status, economic status, and the resources which has gone down to Jharkhand, you have a surplus state in revenue, and that with the division, you have a state which has a cash surplus on terms of mines, resources, etc., and one state which is exclusively agrarian state, and we have a divide there. So how do you balance that?
No, you cannot. I mean, every state cannot be equal. The fact is that there will be some states which will do better than the rest. I mean, nothing will remain constant. You see, there was a time when Punjab was the leading state in the country. It is now 8th. It has to happen. I mean, so somebody will gain. But again, you see, why are we looking at things in a very static mode? I mean, things can change very dynamically. Things can change. I mean, the amount of, and again, because of migration, because of a lot of other things, a lot of other factors are there now with, so these things will happen. These things will continue to happen. You cannot have a perfect political system. The center will have to close down. I mean, the political science departments will have to close down. I mean, all our lecture circuit will have to close down if everything was perfect. So I think in the interest of the Lakshmi Mittal South Asia Institute, let there be some minor issues here and there. What will Sanjay do?
Yes, Aaron also comes from Jharkhand for...
Yeah. So
I think we should, in the interest of this is really, as I think what Dr. Chopra has clearly instigated here is a framework, and for all us to think. I'm just being very mindful of the time of Dr. Chopra. I think we are hitting that, and if people need to leave, and I'm sure like there are lots of questions, which is the goal of this this particular discussion series. And I feel that he has touched upon a variety of topics that we can continue to think about. And I don't know if there is going to be people hanging around. I'm unfortunately not in that position to continue this conversation over a dinner or something. But Dr. Chopra, I'll see you soon, hopefully in the new year again. So I was being mindful.
Yeah. So nice to interact with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Subbu. Thank you for your time and waking up so early to meet us and moderate the session. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Amna. I just want to again thank all the audience there who were able to come there and for the engaged discussions, and also those who are online. So what a privilege it's been. Like, I have heard every time I hear this talk, I hear something new. And one of the things that in the library, every time he would say, it would be a kind of a, oh, Subbu, today I have a new thing to share with you, that he would have gained an insight, whether it's about from his recent, I guess his evolving or the new learning project that he's already started engaging with, which is the language of Sanskrit, and reading through Bhagavad Gita. So more on that later. Maybe that's a whole other topic and the contemporary relevance that may have for us. So anyway, once again, please join me in thanking Dr. Chopra and
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.